sustainability helix. We're not going to spend time on this. So there are a number of other tools. So I just want to point out a few of them. SA 8000 is a type of certification. It's like an ISO. You may have heard of the ISO certification, which stands for International Standards Organization. And what it does is puts a company through an auditing process. Basically, the company has to document their processes, and then every year they get audited and say, yes, we're following these processes. And the SA 8000 is actually an environmental layer over their processes. So they're audited every year to make sure they're complying with a set of environmental standards. The footprint calculators, you've probably heard of these carbon footprint calculators, water calculators, are great tools, and we're actually going to be using one as part of the homework this week. CSR, which I mentioned, is the Corporate Sustainability Report. They're voluntary reports that companies file, and it actually helps companies set a set of goals and measures that they're moving towards and to report on how they're doing. LEED. LEED is something we're going to talk about in greater detail. It stands for Leading Energy and Environmental Design. It's a rating system for buildings, and it's also an accreditation that professionals can get who work with LEED and LEED buildings. And it's something that's been developed and is monitored and managed by the United States Green Building Council, or the USGBC. So here's a summary of sustainable frameworks and tools. You can see that the environmental one is probably the biggest one, and we're going to spend the most time talking about that. Not to say the other ones aren't as important, but with the environment we see so many things happening, and it's often the easiest way to measure and affect change, measurable change. So it's a little bit easier to actually work on and measure. Not to say the other ones aren't equally as important, but with global warming and changes going on, it's really easy to spend time there. And with the amount of energy that we consume and that our buildings actually use, and the amount of CO2 that the buildings put into the ozone, there's a really great impact, a large impact. I'm not sure it's the largest, but a significant impact that we can make in the environmental or natural capital, which is why there's such an emphasis there. Questions. Okay, if you have any questions on sustainable frameworks or tools, please post them on the discussion board. So a couple of strategies. You may have heard these 4 concepts: reduce, reuse, recycle, and restore. In reduce, we want to design for use, meaning the most usable and the most meaningful. Dematerialize. So we want to use as little material, energy, and transportation as possible around our products and services. And in the transportation aspect, it could mean having more local distribution points instead of, for instance, sending everything from someplace on the East Coast to the Midwest to the distribution center, and then having to ship it back to the East Coast when a client on the East Coast wants to buy it. Substitution. Can we substitute materials and energy for the same result, perhaps a better result, or a good enough result that warrants better materials and energy use and still gives us a good outcome? Localization. As I just mentioned, transportation is one reason to think about localization. It can also help support the local economy. Transmaterialisation. Can we change materials and interchange materials? And informationalization. Sharing of information can be really valuable and reduce energy based on a shared information instead of all of us doing the research needed to gather that information. And then, can we reuse objects either as the same type of product or use or as something different? Can we recycle them? Can we restore them either to their original state, to their natural state when they, ashes, back to their organic type state or some other restoration. Design for use: usability, accessibility, clarity, and meaning. So making something as usable as possible. Great design makes something usable by the most amount of people, and something that will actually get used if it's meant to be used, instead of just sitting around looking pretty or forcing us to buy other objects, because the first initial one is not as usable. Accessibility means that it's easy to use and used by the most amount of people. Clarity and meaning is the design clear and the meaning clear, so that we know how to best use it, and it's intuitive and doesn't necessarily require extra instruction. Materials and energy and transportation. Dematerialization. The Apple iPhone and the Apple keyboard are great examples of dematerialization. They've combined a number of different things or different functions. For instance, the iPhone is a number of different things within one. So it's a phone, a computer, a camera. So you've basically dematerialized by putting all those into one object, which also uses less energy in transportation than multiple objects, multiple packages, etc. Apple packaging. Again, they've thought about how to use less materials, energy, and transportation. And there's a very specific process and thinking that goes into the design. Besides the fact that Apple is very focused on their aesthetic, they're very deliberate about their design in terms of dematerialization. So this is just another snapshot of all the different devices that they've combined into the iPhone. Oops. The Mirror Chair by Herman Miller. This is a great example of substitution. So basically what they've done here is put less expensive, less toxic, and more sustainable aspects into the raw materials, the components, and the energy sources. And if you look at the back of the chair, it has perforations, and that design is specifically meant to do a few things. It's attractive, first of all, but it uses less material because there are the perforations. It also makes the material more flexible, more comfortable. So they've used the same material on the seat and the chair, which means the back of the chair and the seat, so they can be disposed of together. You see there are only two colors here, and that's really important, because when you design something to be deconstructed, as this chair is, you make it so all the components have similar materials, similar colors, so that they can be easily melted down together. If you had, for instance, two different types of plastic, they may melt at different heats, different temperatures, so that they can't be melted down together. If they're different colors, they can create a muddy looking or unattractive or unsaleable raw component, recycled component, that can't be used for post-industrial recycling. So this chair was designed so that every piece comes apart easily. I think the back snaps on instead of screwing on, so it can easily come apart to be recycled. Localization. So this is a really important consideration. And what this talks about is the materials that create something, can they be sourced locally? And local is a relative term. The United States Green Building Council, in its LEED certification, defines local as a 500-mile radius. But in any event, the more local, the better, because there are less transportation costs and less emissions based on the transportation when it comes from a greater distance. Again, you support the local economy when you produce locally and ship locally. You're creating more jobs locally. And those profits often go back into the local community in a number of different ways, from the company paying taxes to, again, supporting employees, but also companies sometimes do programs in their local community, whether they sponsor a program at a school or host an event at the facility where they maybe give out gifts over the holidays to underprivileged children. There are a lot of benefits to localization. Transmaterialization. Zip cars is a great example of this. Shared materials. This is a shared product, in fact. You can rent a car for an hour, a day, whatever you need, without having to own the car, where it sits around most of the time.